Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event, A Global South with Chinese Characteristics. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across our 16 programs and centers. There is by now ample evidence that Chinese leaders seek to transform the existing global governance system into one more suited to the interests of a rising China under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. As part of these ambitions, Beijing is increasingly promoting the benefits of authoritarian governance as a route to economic development, with a focus on audiences across the so-called Global South. Indeed, Chinese leader Xi Jinping himself said in 2017 that the lessons from China's own approach to development blazes a new trail for developing countries to achieve modernization, offering a new option for countries who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. One of the main ways that China promotes authoritarian governance is through the routine and expanding provision of training programs to foreign government officials in developing countries around the world. At the heart of many of these programs is a whitewashed message about China's rapid economic development and the role of China's autocratic governance system in that success. In a new forthcoming report, Global China Hub non-resident fellow Neva Yao analyzes a trove of over 1,000 files obtained from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, which details 785 government training programs conducted by Chinese entities and delivered mostly to developing country officials and political parties. This report provides a new level of clarity on the purpose and content of these trainings and their role in Beijing's promotion of authoritarian governance practices. As emphasized in Neva's report, the declared objectives and lessons included in these government training programs offer a clear indication of Beijing's ambition to popularize non-democratic approaches across a range of policy areas and practices. Today, we've gathered a great group of experts to discuss the report's findings, discuss Beijing's training efforts and their intent, and begin to assess the actual impact of these efforts, looking at the extent of developing countries' adoption and adaptation of autocratic practices, and what this means for the trend of surging authoritarianism globally in recent years. We'll also look at how countries across the developing world can ensure access to objective information regarding China's intentions and the representation of China's domestic realities. So this is a really big topic. There's a lot to cover. We're very lucky to have serving as our moderator for this conversation today, the Financial Times U.S.-China correspondent, Dimitri Sevastopoulos. Dimitri covers all aspects of U.S.-China relations in his role with the FT, ranging from foreign policy, security and intelligence, to trade and business and technology. He took up this post in 2021 after serving as Washington bureau chief during the Trump administration. And in over two decades at the FT, he has also served as U.S. politics correspondent, Pentagon and CIA correspondent, South China correspondent, and Washington business correspondent. Dimitri spent 4 years in Hong Kong as Asia news editor, running the FT's news operations in the region. So great to have you joining us today, Dimitri. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning. And thank you for tuning in to what I think will be a fascinating discussion about what China is doing in the Global South to promote its political and political economy systems. Before we start, just for housekeeping, I want to remind everyone that we'll have about 20 minutes of questions from the audience at the end. And you can submit a question by going to the link askac.org, askac.org, and it's very easy to input a question there, so please do so. We'll try and get to as many as we can. In a moment, we're going to hear from Neva Yao, who, as Dave mentioned, is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and she has produced this very interesting report called A Global South with Chinese Characteristics, which will be available online tomorrow. And then we're going to have a discussion with Neva and the other panelists, Victoria Chongqing, Oscar Otele, and William Picos, about what they are seeing in their particular regions of expertise. But to get started, I don't want to steal Neva's thunder. It's her report, but just to briefly introduce the topic, it's a very interesting and I would say very timely look at how China is trying to expand its influence around the world, and particularly how it's using its economic model and its economic success to promote the argument that its system provides an alternative model to what the US and its Western allies are promoting. From my own perspective, as someone who covers the US and China and the Indo-Pacific, I think it's great to see research like this that hones in on what China is doing in countries that frankly are not getting as much media focus, particularly from the media in Washington, as there should be. So it's a very welcome report. It's a very important trend that needs to be focused on. And with that, let me hand over the virtual stage to Neva. Good morning, Neva. Over to you.
Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you everyone for coming in today. I will just take the first few minutes to talk about the summary of the report because it's still not out yet. But basically to set the scene for the discussion. So when I started this research about end of last year, the question I had in mind was what China actually wants to achieve in the world. We have the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013. And then 2 years ago, we saw the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. And if you read through those Chinese language policy documents, for these grand initiatives, you can see they actually contain very vague language about Chinese objectives in the world. So I wanted to find internal planning documents. I wanted to find policy descriptions and activities instructions that were not aimed for the public, not for foreign audiences, not for domestic audiences in China. I wanted to know, amongst themselves inside the Chinese government, what kind of objectives are being communicated, especially when it comes to the Global South. So I found 1,691 internal files that detailed governmental training programs that the Chinese government delivered to developing countries in 2021 and 2022. They were sitting on a website server run by the Ministry of Commerce. But as I started looking into the training programs, I realized that my data is actually only a tip of the iceberg, because later I also found 10 other Chinese ministries and departments that have delivered their own training programs to foreign government officials in the past 3 years. And so I had to look back a little bit at history, at how these programs came about. So when they started in the 90s, the average number of programs delivered were only 142. And then in early 2010s, they became 975. And then late 2010, 1,400. So the numbers are increasing at such a rapid level. And with most of the time, 25 participants in each program, the scale of the audience that these programs target are quite large. So for me, going through the files, they contain various details. It comes with a title that tells you what the subject of the training is. There's a name of the subcontracted Chinese entity that the ministry gave the contract to deliver the training. It tells you about the timing of the training, so the length of how many days. Tells you about the language of instruction. So mostly it's in English, but they're also in Spanish, Arabic, French, targeting various regions, group sizes, who are the countries invited, and what was very interesting was who exactly are they targeting. So this would be, they would list the specific level, even of the government officials that they want from a specific ministry. Their age, their education background, they would list that as the targeted demographics. And then, of course, further down the documents, and by the way, the report that comes out tomorrow will come with selected 14 files where you can see for yourself what these internal program planning documents look like. And so, so after these sort of personal sort of target logistical information, it details the exact descriptions of the sessions of what the training is about. It even includes names of instructors and contact information of the people. And I welcome everybody to take a look at it and get a feel of what they're about. As for me, when I went through all the files, I can see a pattern where nearly all of them would first brief the participants about Chinese reform. about the political thought guidelines from Xi Jinping and using these to set the scene of whatever that is being taught. And I could not understand these training programs as humanitarian assistance programs, and they are not just directed at business. They're not just about building soft power, but they were quite clear to me as authoritarian governments' export programs. At the end of the day, I think the Chinese government can only teach what it knows and what it does. So when it is, at these training programs, when it is telling others that economic successes comes from its political system, it is at the same time saying law enforcement should be designed to protect the state and the party rather than the people. It is saying that journalism is about creating national unity rather than acting as a check against the system. It is also saying that the law is intended to protect the regime rather than the citizens. So it's quite inevitable to me that these training programs offered to foreign officials became so natural in their authoritarian export character. And this is why my report is titled Global South with Chinese Characteristics, because this is what's in Beijing's imagination. I'll stop here for now.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Neva. Before we bring in the other panelists, I just have two kind of quick questions for you about the report. I'm curious, has the acceleration in the number of programs that China is running around different countries in the Global South, has that accelerated dramatically under Xi Jinping, or was it already accelerating and kind of continued at the same pace?
It has definitely accelerated under Xi Jinping specifically. I think this is a natural trend that comes along with the other foreign engagement that China has engaged in. I think Xi Jinping just, has a very different idea about China's place in the world. And I think, the training programs are, amongst other things, the trend that he put in. However, I would say the idea of doing this is not new.
Okay. The other thing I want to ask you was, it's interesting how you were able to get the documents. Is the Chinese government kind of cracking down on the ability to get documents like this, or are they still, if you go online now, can you find these things quite easily?
This is such a tricky question to answer, because if I say yes, there's still a lot that you could find on open source, then obviously there are going to be efforts to try and get rid of those files. In the past 5 years, there's been significant increase of efforts removing a lot of files, and this actually isn't the first time I've been exposed to these kind of this exact type of files. I've also been able to find 3-4 years ago from another ministry, but then 2 months later they disappeared. So this is actually, I would say, one of the last place where the program descriptions could be found. And I think for trade and for other areas, there are still some information out there too, but it is closing down very rapidly.
So is it, just finally before we open up, is it something that you think the Chinese Communist Party is kind of keen to advertise, or is it something that they're trying to do and would rather have less international exposure or a light shone on what they're doing?
This is definitely not an area that they are actively promoting as something that as part of aid, because this is actually not part of aid. This is not part of aid at all, and this is why it's not being promoted. And the only reason and this is an educated guess, that the only reason why these files could be found was the fact that they were delivered online, because in 2021 and 2022, it was still pandemic era, and these programs were delivered online. And because of the switch to online, more files, planning files were able to be found, because the logistics of administrative work were moved for this type of work online, and that was the only reason.
Okay, that's really interesting. All right, let me bring in our other panelists. With us this morning, we have Victoria Chongqing, who is a specialist on Latin America, and she's a non-resident fellow at the Adrian Arsht Latin American Center at the Atlantic Council. We also have William Picos, who is an expert on the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Pacific Island nations. and he's also a non-resident fellow at the Global China Hub. And we're hoping to have Oscar Otele, who's an Africa specialist, another non-resident fellow at the Global China Hub. He's having a little bit of IT problems right now, but hopefully Oscar will be able to join us shortly as well. Victoria, can I start with you? And I'm going to ask each of you the same question just to kick off. Can you give us an example, kind of specific case studies of what China is doing in the countries that you focus on in terms of the programs, the type of people that are participating, you know, how they're run, just a kind of a snapshot of the countries that you look at and how it's happening?
Great. Thank you, Dimitri, for the question, and Neva for the report. And I think that I have to precede my comments, right, by saying that since I focus on Latin America and the Caribbean, it's important to emphasize that this is actually a region that has struggled with democracy for a long time, even before China has came in. So I think that the way I would look at it, and probably reframing the question, right, is not only what China has doing, but what is the intention, going back to what Neva has said, and in this case is to change the narrative. What do I mean? Changing the narrative about what China represents for many of the countries in this region, the kind of partner that China can be, right? So we are moving away, not necessarily of saying that China is an authoritarian country and therefore this is bad, but rather saying, right, despite being an authoritarian country, right, China has been and is helpful in our development process. So in this case, China has been great in capitalizing, right, the narrative of development, the narrative of Latin American countries, or in this case, countries of the global south needing a voice. So what examples can I see? At least in my experience, a lot of these documents from the Chinese side, as Neva said, they are perhaps online and in specific servers and whatnot. In Latin America, some of these training programs have actually been announced, right, and saying, oh, this is part of the collaboration with China. And this is part of the collaboration with China to show us, right, what China has done right? So in this case, really marrying the example of what kind of economic development has been achieved, how poverty has ended and whatnot. So in this case, it's more, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, changing the narrative of what China represents. So for instance, an example that I can give you is that many journalists, especially with the Belt and Road initiatives, right, Latin American, Caribbean journalists, not only once or twice, but twice or even more, if so, have been invited to China, going into these training programs in how the Chinese media system works, right? And not only that, in addition to how the Chinese media system works, right, look at how China operates, look at our system, look at what China has achieved in all these years. And the expectation is that the narrative, when these journalists come back, right, will be positive. Has that been the case? Not always. And I think that here is where I shift a little bit from what Neva presents in the report, but pay attention more on the countries that go, who the actors are, right, and what they do after this training. So I think that that's an important question that hopefully we'll see in a next future iteration of the report, right? Not only what China is doing, but rather the influence and the impact of these different training sessions, which at least in my region, all right, is debatable, because in some cases, in countries where, let's say, there is a little bit more of democratic leaning, right, even if the journalists come with a positive narrative about China, there is still, I guess, criticism against it, right, against China, against the deals that it operates and whatnot. So again, going back to who are the actors that are taking these narratives and what is the intention, what is the exchange of it. So at least that is what I can say briefly.
If Victoria, if I can just follow with one question on that. If you look at countries in Latin America that are, you know, the difference between more democratic and less democratic countries, when their journalists go to China, are you seeing any patterns that the countries who send, you know, the democratic countries that send journalists, their journalists are coming back with one view, and the non-democratic countries' journalists are coming back with a different view, or is it not that clean?
It's not that clean, I would say, right? There's definitely, perhaps in let's say, and I have seen that in Peru, my home country, in Chile, in Argentina, right, where the journalists that go come back and they write the reports and say, this is what China has achieved. And not only the journalists, even some politicians that have also done the exchange programs, right, with Congress and whatnot, and they come back and say, well, China is a millenary country. China is a millenary civilization. They have achieved this much in 4 or 5 decades and whatnot, right? So this is great. What does that mean? But then eventually fizzles out, because depending on the events or the circumstances of what's happening within these countries, right? Let's say in my home country, again, Peru, there are politicians or there are journalists that maybe come back and then have a more positive view about how important, right, China it is as a partner. And then when something goes wrong in a investment project, then the criticism comes, right? This is a problem, let's say, of doing business in China, right, or doing business with China, because they don't respect environmental laws or they don't respect labor laws. So this is something that we grapple with, right? Because on the one hand, again, like I said, China is really great and has been really great in capitalizing the narrative of development, the narrative that it is a great partner. And I think that that's something that hopefully I can, if of everything that I'm saying, right, something that can be remembered is that at least in Latin America, based on the programs that China has done or the kind of interactions, it's more about changing the narrative that China, despite its authoritarian regime, it is a partner, it is a worthy partner to have because of the needs for many of these countries, which objectively speaking, right, China, it is an important partner, economically speaking, right? But then the other question is that by having that kind of narrative, it also presents itself as a flexible partner, and not only that, as a partner of choice, as a chosen partner, if that makes sense. So it's not that all in China is bad, but despite what is bad with China, it is still useful for us. So this is how we are seeing, at least how this is playing on, at least in the countries that I look at and in the region that I look at.
Great, that's very interesting. Thank you. Will, over to you. Does what Victoria, how she described the situation in Latin America, does that mirror what you're seeing in the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific Island nations?
Yes, in many ways. I feel like, U.S.-China strategic competition in the Pacific Islands is, heating up, something that we've seen over the past few years, and China has used these training sessions, many of which they readily publicize, these sessions about tackling climate change, providing agricultural assistance, cultural exchange, poverty reduction, all of these they're very willing to, share, and publicize. And that seems to be something that's very important to China, is to be seen as, a good partner, someone that these countries in these Pacific Island nations can work with. At the same time, I'd also mention that, in the Solomon Islands, for example, you have the Ministry of Public Security training police forces, and this has been a point of contention. And I know that they are certainly in NEVA's report. These are, a ministry that is involved in a lot of these types of training sessions, and that's certainly something that's concerning, I think, beyond the Pacific Islands as well.
Can I ask you, you mentioned the Solomon Islands. I remember, I think that news came out towards the end of 2022 and surprised a lot of people in Washington, that China had signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands. And within a few weeks, Kurt Campbell, the top Indo-Pacific official at the White House, was on a plane to the Solomon Islands. A lot of what's been happening in the region has, I think, caught the US a little bit unawares. In terms of these Chinese programs, was the US aware that this was happening and actually trying to counter it in any way?
To what I know, certainly not enough. I think that there was a degree to which, China has been a rather steady influence diplomatically and economically in the Pacific Islands. And there's an extent to which my perspective is that the US, was caught napping, and then saw what China was doing. There were signs, in 2019, Solomon Islands and Kiribati switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the PRC, and that certainly should have been, and was alarming, I know, but that didn't necessarily precipitate the action that we saw after the security agreement in the Solomon Islands, and we're fortunately starting to see a lot more action on that front, both from the Trump administration and now through the Biden administration, more engagement with the Pacific Islands, more diplomatic presence, embassies, and economic engagement. And all of that is very important. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done, especially in thinking about the needs, the local priorities of these countries. One of the major ones is tackling climate change and the threat of rising seas. And as I mentioned before, those are training sessions that China has been involved in and has been very readily promoting widely.
Okay. Neva, we're still trying to get Oscar back in to give us the perspective from Africa, but can you talk a little bit about Central Asia? Because I know that's an area that you've looked at as well.
Yeah, I just also want to respond to Victoria and Will, actually. So, I get that in some parts of the world, these programs are, heavily promoted as an area of cooperation. But I think what is, so while most of the programs at those sessions talk about climate change or security cooperation or whatever small topics. So in my data set, even very innocent topics such as beekeeping or bamboo forestry or low carbon development. So when Chinese achievements in these areas are being taught, all of them inevitably in the program descriptions trace the origin back to Chinese reform. It is the party's authoritarian political system that made all of these achievements happen. I think perhaps there is and this is where, we need to actually do the research and map out the effectiveness, right? Because maybe there's a cultural translation where, none of this worked. It just leaves participants with an impression that China is great or China is doing well, but it's not necessarily taking up the idea of what the party is trying to do in terms of, promoting the authoritarian preferences behind those achievements. Oh, and about Central Asia, yes. So so about 3 years ago, I have looked at this particular issue in Central Asia, these training programs that are being taught to Central Asian government officials. And I remember having done a couple of interviews with people that have went and came back. Particularly, I remember a woman who was a judge at a local court who went on a legal affairs training in China. And when she came back, I asked her, what was something that, jumped out to you, in training? And she said, and this is not in the report because this is not an area specific report, but I could share this example is in another writing somewhere. And she said that the Chinese were teaching about a smart court system where AI and a digital system is being used to determine outcomes and sentences of court cases. And she thought that this was bizarre because if they were to import such a system, she would be out of a job. So a lot of these things don't work, right? And I think it's fair. But what are the things that have worked? That's something that we're still having discussion about.
Well, if there's one question I'd like to ask all of you, so which is kind of a broad question, and it kind of piggybacks on what you just said, Neva, which is, what is the evidence to date that what China's doing is effective? What are they trying to achieve? So I'll just give one personal example. I got a Chinese government scholarship to study Chinese at Beijing University when I was younger. And while I don't think it gave me one perspective or another on the Chinese government, it gave me an affinity for China and got me interested in China. To what extent do you think they're just trying to hook people and win kind of more hearts and minds around the world, get people closer to or more interested in China? And to what extent do you think they're actually trying to use this as propaganda, and to kind of indoctrinate foreign officials in ways that can actually help them when they're dealing with those countries as those participants in the programs become more senior in their respective systems. Maybe, Neva, do you want to just address that one, and then I'll open that one up to Victoria and Will as well?
I think so. The training programs are one part of, various activities and strategies that China is doing in their, very strategic engagement with foreign officials. So one part of the training program is that every single participant is asked to submit a report to the Chinese trainers about their country's current level of cooperation with China and with other foreign countries like United States or Japan on whatever topic that it was being taught. And this report is extremely important for the Chinese side because immediately is a valuable report of an assessment of the person who's writing it. In terms of how they view their country's level of cooperation with China in that particular topic, what are some suggestions that they raised, and if they are individuals who want to increase cooperation, informal discussions can already happen, and this is this is this has been an element that has been a part in these programs, and I can see why it would be useful, for such kind of collection.
So intelligence gathering purposes. Will, I think, do you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah. I think Neva details in the report that Chinese embassies, are the ones identifying individuals to join these trainings, and then these individuals choose to opt in and participate in these programs. I think that's a really important to recognize in thinking about the effect that they can have, that China is choosing who's going to be involved, and that can build relationships, party ties. It can help elite capture, or find civil servants that are sympathetic to China's offerings. And I think that's really important. I think also on the intelligence gathering aspect, that really caught my eye as well. In my research on Chinese economic statecraft, and especially its use of positive economic incentives, Beijing has shown an adeptness at identifying the needs of developing countries. Even if in the long run we know that these projects don't go to plan, these trainings seem like they can be an important way that China can learn about local priorities, based on the reporting requirements of these sessions, and China's inquiries into cooperation opportunities, and that allows Beijing to potentially offer up, a project that allows Beijing to look like it's meeting local demands in the country, or again, sort of for a favored party or a specific politician.
Interesting. Okay, Victoria, what about in Latin America? How effective do you think these programs are?
Oh, definitely it helps, right? Especially in the propaganda aspect. And I think that echoing what Will and Eva were saying, in many ways, thinking about who the actors are, who get invited, those who participate, and at least in the Latin American perspective, right, is that how important they are in the government and how long they will be in the government. Because I think that in many cases, especially for governments where there is political instability, at least in my region, right? Sometimes when there are deals, it helps to have that representative in there, right? So in that way, there is a degree of elite capture. And I think that this is precisely why I say that while it's important, and the report is very important in pointing out what the Chinese are planning, let's say, right, for these countries, it's also essential to pay attention who the actors are and what levels and to what degree and which sectors they are in. And I think that something that it made me think about when I was reading the report and whatnot was to really, let's say, have that light bulb moment, right, in which is that not only is China necessarily saying that legitimizing its rule, right, in the outside world, but at the same time, it's really reinforcing and helping many authoritarian regimes or leaders with authoritarian leaning, because it distracts for some of the things that go inside. And I explain, right? Because what happens is that China is offering itself as a partner of choice. It's also offering itself as a partner that is needed. And what happens is that by offering that, maybe intentionally and unintentionally, depending on the narrative that is presenting, right, it is aiding some of these leaders who have more authoritarian leanings by offering these resources, by becoming this partner. I hope that is understood. So I think that is something that we would need to pay attention to, right? And again, this is something that we grapple with because, as William said, China is really good and has been very adept at actually offering the things that these countries need, that unfortunately, right, whether because of their political situation, economic situation, they cannot get the partners or the support or the deals that they might want to. So in many ways, China is suffering that with that gathering of information. And we have seen that in Latin America. And really briefly, really quick, right? When I was discussing some of my field work in Peru, for instance, talking to former officials, something that they pointed out is say, like, well, we have many partners and we want to work with the United States. We want to work with countries in the European Union, but China comes and basically what they say is that, what do you need? What do you need? How we can reframe this, right? Versus coming in here and or like other partners, right? These are the conditions, but rather the Chinese come and say, well, you have development needs, we want to cooperate, right? What kind of deals do you need? And I think that here is also important to pay attention to not only the Chinese state, but other Chinese actors that are also at play. And in many cases, you have the corporations, you have or state-owned enterprises, or even mid-level officials. So here, it's not so simple as just top down, but rather to also think about all the actors involved in these dynamics.
And can I just ask you, and actually for all of you, when you look at the participants from each country, what kind of person is being selected? Are these people who are starting their careers, mid-career? You know, what's the kind of, what does the array of participants kind of look like if you break it down? Neva, do you want to address that?
Yeah, if I start first, so I think it's like, I agree with what Victoria said. It's not just, it's not just top down, but it is going like this, where it is the top down, high level government officials are being targeted, and then you also have technical level of civil servants who are being targeted, and this is only through the training programs, right? And and this is only through training programs from one specific ministry that I have data on. And there's 10 other ministries and departments that run their own other programs that target journalists. Journalists are specifically going to programs run by State Council. Mm-hmm. So that is another set of programs that target another group. So when we look at it holistically, it is almost as if is anybody who China can reach out to. Because that is the resource that the government has, in their, diplomacy or engagement, whatever you want to call it. But whatever it is doing, at the end of the day, these programs, however much they look like they are just about enhancing cooperation in whatever area it is, at the end of the day, the way that it is planned out is for the participants to at least leave with a feeling that the Chinese government is very competent. They know what they are doing. Mm-hmm. We should learn from them in maybe this small area, and then maybe next year another bigger area, and maybe in 5 years it will be something even bigger. This doesn't come from me, but in another workshop, a closed-door workshop, someone said talk about some African examples, and Oscar is not here. I wish he was here, but a participant said, in Kenya, I think, or it was Tanzania, there are specific party slogans that are being crafted based on slogans of the Chinese Communist Party. So there has been trend of definitely China is willing to teach these authoritarian practices, and there are bound to be high-level political leaders who want to learn from that.
Interesting. Will, Victoria, do you want to weigh in a little bit more on that?
In the example that that I gave you about the media, right? A lot of them are journalists from important media outlets in the countries, right? They're the mainstream media outlets, and I think that again, right, the at least in Latin America, it's more about the discourse and the narrative of what China is or what China could be for the region or for each of these countries, right? And again, I think that when it comes to the officials, at least from what I've seen, are the ones who are in the government, in Congress, or mid-level, let's say, right?
Yeah.
To a certain degree do have influence, and I think that and this is something that it's also interesting, right? That we are discussing this as if it's something necessarily, perhaps we didn't know, right? From and the report, Niva is telling us more or less what the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese leadership is seeking in this country. But for instance, at least in Latin America, when these trips happen, when this training happens, they're published, right? They're published, and of course, the narrative again comes back to what some of these files say, right? To not only emphasize the bilateral relationship or the, I guess, cross-regional relationship between China and the region or each of these countries, but also to emphasize, right, South-South cooperation, development, and whatnot. So in many ways, it's legitimization, right? Legitimacy of the Chinese leadership, of their actions, what they have doing, and to many of the countries in this region, and for the officials, and even for the media, or even other groups, businesses and whatnot, right, is to say that despite being an authoritarian regime, these are the things that have worked, and therefore we are a worthy partner. And I think that that's something that really makes us think about what this represents for the international system, and how we view these countries in the global south, right? What they need, what their interests, and what are the trade-offs? What are the trade-offs that these countries are willing to do because of certain needs that perhaps they cannot achieve with other partners?
Well, maybe I can ask the three of you, if you look at what the US does around the world, I mean, the US has been engaged in different kinds of programs and exchanges, the Peace Corps, Voice of America, and a whole range of things that are, designed to try and promote US values around the world. And a very recent example, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, went to Cambodia last week to try and wean Cambodia off China, because the new Prime Minister of Cambodia is a graduate of West Point and New York University. So I'm curious, what has China learned from the way the US has tried to promote its interests over the world? Are there many similarities, or is it very different? Will, would you like to tackle that one?
I mean, what I can speak to is, there's a perception that China is ahead in this space, in this current moment. I feel that its diplomatic messaging is more centralized, I would say, in a way that has it ahead. And this is thinking about its in the media space, China's ability to push its own narrative, and I think this is a big problem at the moment. And at the same time, the United States is somewhat divided in its ability to do that, and I think that's the U.S. needs to improve its ability. I also want to talk briefly about larger economic alternatives. That's something that Victoria mentioned earlier that I think that's also very important to this story. There is the diplomatic messaging, which I think U.S. can improve on, but there are also fundamentally economic needs in a lot of developing countries that are not being met by Western entities and countries. And so there is there are two pieces to it. There's the diplomatic messaging, the media side, and then there's also what we're offering tangibly to these countries, and I think that there are improvements that could be made on both.
Niva, did you want to say something, or?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think at the end of the day, it is a choice whether or not you want to promote your government system overseas. And United States definitely do, because it states that very clearly, in their approach, is honest about it. China, on the other hand, we have all heard how Beijing says that it respects other countries to pursue approaches, however specific to their own context. And, that China respects the path of other countries, whatnot. But based on the reading of these files, that doesn't seem true. It seems that China is indeed wanting to promote authoritarian governance using its own economic success as a primary argument. So, so I think it's very important that China has to admit that it does want to promote, its government systems overseas, and we have to all keep that in mind, because at the end of the day, it is a choice that you want to do that or not. And I say why it's a choice, because not every government want to do that. For example, when I was based out in Central Asia, I was observing how Japan and South Korea conducts their very successful public diplomacy and engagement in the region. And however, they don't promote their government system to a point where, when I ask people, did you know that Japan and South Korea are very successful democracies? People don't know. So it is a matter of choice whether or not you promote your government system, and China has definitely made a choice.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask another question, which is, let's say the three of you were briefing Congress on why and what the US needs to do to counter China. Many of these countries we're talking about don't get as much focus or attention in Washington as they should. And simple example is the Munich Security Conference a few months ago had a massive delegation of US lawmakers. But the Singapore Shangri-La Dialogue in Asia a couple of weeks ago had a much smaller representation from Congress. Lawmakers seem to tend to veer back towards the Middle East and Europe by default. So what arguments would you make to the US Congress as to why they should spend money so the US government can do more to counter China? Victoria, would you like to?
I was like, I can take the ball. So going back to what I was saying earlier, right? A lot of it comes to needs. And I think that what China has really done great in the last 20 years, since the early 2000s, perhaps, is to bring the capital, to bring the projects and infrastructure that many of these countries, and like William said, and like I said earlier, right, really need. And I think that here is where, and it made me think of a new book that I think Oriana Mastro is writing about. And part of her argument, right, whether we like it or not, is that the US should spend more money. It does. I think it would help it, right, to spend more money in the sense of investing in not only in infrastructure, but I love the programs that many of these countries do need. That is not to say that the US is not doing more, but I guess in the case of Latin America, especially in the last 10 years, it was almost like a forgotten region, despite its proximity, right? And here's the caveat, at least with this particular region, is that the nature of the relationship with the United States is also very complex, right? Because we have this history of interference, we have this history of intervention. So there are more layers in there, right? Just starting with immigration, which has been a big issue, not only in Congress, but also by the two parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, right? The Democrat Party and whatnot. And I think for many Latin American countries, that's one of the big issues too. So I guess what I would say, right, is that if I were to front of Congress, pay more attention and really focus on what the countries are actually asking for. Not to say, right, that the US doesn't pay attention. Sometimes it does, but sometimes, let's say, if I will, the US sometimes provides the kind of help that it thinks the region needs versus, right, emphasizing what the region actually needs. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think that's a little bit of a difference too.
Do you think China does a better job on that front? In terms
of
listening to what the countries actually want as opposed to what China thinks they want?
I think it brings more flexibility, right? I think that when it comes, is to say, well, I have the money, I have all these things. Okay, here's where I can give you this. And one of the biggest examples, right? And here's where it would be hard to compete because objectively speaking, China does have the capital and that I guess, speed, right? In big infrastructure projects, big ports, and what have you. And for instance, which has become a very controversial topic, but at least in Peru, for instance, right, the construction of the Chancay port has been a big issue because for the longest time, that's one of the main things that the country has wanted and needs, not only for its development process, but its connection with Asia. And Costco came and gained the licitation, right? And it's bringing in its construction. Again, there's a lot of controversy. I think that we don't have space in right now to really go into it. But this is an example of the capacity that it brings. It's not necessarily that the U.S. has been necessary. It's not that China has been better, but rather it has had more resources. And going back to the report that Niva says, right, it really gathers the information of what these countries want, and it finds a way to really adapt to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So Niva, aside from sending lawmakers your report and making sure they read it, if you had kind of the 1 minute, 2 minute pitch for them, how do you get them on board?
I think the one problem that I think is the most worrying is the way that this is going to create greater ideological and political polarization globally. And I think your example of the Munich Security Forum and the Shangri-La dialogue is exactly that. People are not talking to each other. And, you know, when China is creating even more doubts about democracy as an ideal form of government, it just polarizes this divide even stronger. Even if countries do not adopt, you know, the whole system of authoritarian governance, adaptation in some specific areas will still mean that those countries will not be able to align with the United States anymore, or any other democracies, you know, on a range of policy issues that will shape global governance. And I'll just leave internet as one example. You know, China has a very particular approach to policing on the internet that is different from the way that Europe and the United States would go about it. And, you know, some Asian countries are already following China's footsteps. So already these effects are becoming apparent in many different areas.
Will, you know, we talked about how when the Solomon Islands deal with China came about, all of a sudden the US kicked into gear and started trying to do things more widely in the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia. Are you seeing enough US attention being paid right now, or is it always kind of a little bit too reactive?
My sense is that it's too reactive, I believe. You know, turning back to the Pacific Islands, I think that the diplomatic presence that we have begun to increase, you know, is not enough, and that is in particular in comparison to China, which you know, is there, is very present, and that means that they have ins with, you know, political parties and leaders in ways that the United States doesn't, simply because the presence isn't quite as great. You know, and you know, I think in Southeast Asia, the South China Sea makes the you know, everything security focused, and rightfully so in many ways. But you know, I think that there's also a lot of economic work to be done in the Indo-Pacific that you know, is lacking. You know, there's certainly the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but you know, there are a lot of gripes in the region about that, and I think that demands more attention. One thing I did also want to highlight from the report that I thought was really important and has been important in my research is, you know, focusing on education and expertise on China in developing countries. You know, this is so important to fighting Chinese propaganda and sort of the authoritarian governance narratives that you know, this report and Niva has really focused on. And so this is something that, you know, I certainly think the United States has the capacity to assist with. You know, and it's really central to allowing these countries to make sovereign and informed decisions around Chinese economic engagement and its governance model. You know, these countries won't always choose the United States or the West. Like, there will be times where China is the better deal, but the more information that, you know, we can try and assist them with, you know, including around these training sessions and how China is trying to smuggle in some of this ideology. I think sharing more on that is really important.
No, that's a very good point. Okay, we have, let's go over to Q&A. We have quite a few questions have come in already, which is great. Some of them are directed specifically at one or more of you, and others are just more general for everyone. But the first one I have, Neva, is actually for you, and it's from Asanga. And Asanga asks, the Sri Lankan government officials have been part of many Chinese training programs, and Chinese expansion from Belt and Road projects is visible in Sri Lanka. Is there anything specific in your report or your research that kind of looks at China's role in South Asia or Sri Lanka in particular?
I think this is where, I would add my, if I were, to be giving U.S. policymakers, why they should be worried about this. My second point were to be, when China, through these training programs and amongst other things, builds better relations and have these countries look at China as someone they really want to work with, China is able to build inroads into strategic sectors and infrastructure that, further down the line, especially when relations with the United States isn't great, these are assets for China in whatever circumstances, whatever situation it is. And it is not just about ports, but also about other sectors and infrastructure. So in Sri Lanka, it's been one of the very important case. But I think in South Asia, particularly in Sri Lanka, one of the most worrying propaganda that when I went there and have learned was the way that China is promoting the historical relations between China and Sri Lanka based on thousands of years of Buddha's exchanges. And Sri Lankans genuinely think, and that's based on only my interaction, this needs to be more substantiated, obviously, with real research, is that Sri Lankans genuinely believed that China was a Buddhist country. And this is based on that, they think it's great, to have stronger relations with China. Now, where do these narratives come from? Because obviously, we know this isn't true. The Sri Lankans are not talking about Tibet. They're no longer talking about Tibet and the way that Buddhists are treated in China. And I think this is where, the implications of these narratives are not just about, the promotions, but also about it shows exactly what China wants to get out of the relationship. And in Sri Lanka's case, Sri Lanka no longer talking about Tibet is actually one of the very strategic goal, I would say, beyond the port.
Yeah, so that's kind of an example of where China has been successful, you think, in terms of the propaganda. There's a very good question that's come in from a Senate staffer, which is, how much money is the Chinese Communist Party spending on these diplomatic programs and training? I don't know if, Neva, if your research shed any light on that, or do we know how much money they're spending?
No, I have no data on that.
No, okay. Victoria, Will, have you heard anything about that?
I can chime in really quickly. I don't have the specifics, but for instance, right, in some of the, I don't know if specifically is for the training, but for instance, when Honduras switched relationship, right, from Taiwan to China, and a couple of journalists or some journalists were sent to China, right, to cover and learn about the country. My understanding is that thousands of dollars were spent because just plane tickets, right? Sure. So plane tickets, hotels. So we're talking about thousands of dollars. So there's really an investment because again, right, I think that's something that we are thinking about or we should pay heed to also is that China is looking at long-term relationships because this is about building relationships, right? It's not only a one-time thing, even though what I said earlier, it's specific, there are specific actors and at least for countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, there's a lot of political instability. And yet, there is this idea that we need to build these ties. So even if, let's say, the journalist is not working in this media, or even if the official is not in the government, right, there's still that relationship that in some ways creates the network of I guess, allies, if you will, or friends. And I think that that's something that we need to pay attention to. And really quickly, and I think that I wanted to emphasize, right, I think that one thing that in the previous questions about how the US could react, I think that one of the things that hasn't helped the US, at least in Latin America, has been used to reactive approach, right, towards Chinese competition and whatnot, because I think that what has created is that it's viewed almost as a condescending perspective, right? Rather, I think that something that can help the US, in addition to what I say, right, spend more money and whatnot, is to really keep in mind that China is there to stay, in the sense that China will be there. It is competition. So what the US needs to do is to really focus and pay attention in how else they can compete, like smartly and effectively compete with China. I think that that's something that we forget many times when discussing these issues.
That's a good point. But it strikes me that if there's any way to find out how much money China is spending, which I know is probably not that easy, that's probably something that you could use with US lawmakers to make the case as to why the American government needs to spend more. Another question.
One thing I wanted.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if I could jump in very quickly, another non-answer on how much money is being spent. But in the Pacific Islands, the training sessions that I've seen, China has built new areas in which they can train, new buildings, in both in China and in countries. I am forgetting which one at the moment, so I'm not going to speculate. But both locally in the Pacific Island country and in China, focused on tackling climate change or agricultural technical assistance. Those are the two that come to mind. They're new buildings. So that definitely suggests a large investment. Yeah, no, good point. One question, another question's just come in, is to what extent has China tried to export its surveillance state model to the global south? I don't know who would like to, anyone want to address that one?
I think when Victoria comes back on, she can talk more about that. But I think this is where overwhelmingly governments around the world have to want these systems also, and many of the governments around the world do already want these systems for authoritarian purposes, or simply because it's a cheap option to have a city camera system to do all the monitoring that they need to do. So and China provides a very cheap option. Not just the hardware is very cheap, but the consulting is also very cheap. And already these systems are so easy for China to implement, because China and Chinese companies have already been the contracted companies in these developing countries modernizing their telecommunications for years. And not just telecommunications, but the energy systems and all that. So already Chinese companies are in a very good position to know exactly how to do that in a way that Singapore, for example, which has a very good smart city, surveillance type of system that is less like China, but Singapore will not be able to export a system, to developed countries, because it would just be too expensive. So Victoria would be good for the elaboration on Latin America, actually.
Victoria, did you catch that question?
Yeah. Could you repeat the question, please? Sorry, my internet went off briefly.
Sure, of course. To what extent is China trying to export its surveillance state model to countries in Latin America?
Well, I mean, the example that we see, right, and I think that I'm going to piggyback on what Niva said. It's offering cheaper options, and rather than think about exporting it, it's rather the narrative, right? The discourse that is showing is that it's helping to combat crime, which the region also experiences. For instance, in the case of Ecuador, right, it did have and it bought a lot of Chinese surveillance and with his police, right? Because the goal was to monitor crime. And it's really fascinating, because I think that when that happened, right, especially from external media or even within Ecuador, there was concern about, right, privacy issues, how Ecuadorian police is perhaps using technology that comes from an authoritarian country, and yet when also talking to some locals, it's like, well, it's combating crime. So I think that again, right here is the challenge, because on the one hand, you have something in here, monitoring, surveillance, what that represents, right? That is concerning when we think about liberal democratic values, right? And also privacy. But on the other hand, we also have the challenge that in Ecuador and in many Latin American countries, you have also crime, you have violence, and that is of big concern for these governments. So on the one hand, it's addressing the issue, the need that the country has, or a city, if you will. On the other hand, there is what kind of potential, what the implications are. And I think that here it really falls back on the local governments, right? On what they can do in really holding those democratic institutions, in really holding the rule of law, in really holding the policies and the rules, right, that will protect the individual, versus leaning towards the more, let's say, authoritarian, basically suppressing personal freedoms kind of way.
Yeah. Another question is, and I'm going to maybe broaden this out, but the question is there a specific industry that China seems to be most interested in when it's working with Global South countries? And just to piggyback on that question, I should have asked earlier, if you look at the different countries where China is running these programs, the programs that you looked at in your report, Neva, is there a kind of a geographic concentration with a lot more in one region versus the other, or is it reasonably well spread over different regions? Neva, do you want to jump in on that first?
Okay, I'll go first with the geographical region. So I want to say 80% of the training programs locations are named as developing countries. And then amongst the 20% is quite evened out between Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, actually. So the way that you could see also in the developing countries category, what region they target is also through the language that they look at. So this would be Arabic, for example, which would be for Arabic countries. So this is an area that needs more precise look at. It's actually quite hard to do, but it's definitely only the Global South. And I think Will is better for the first question.
Yeah, Will, do you want to jump in there?
Sorry, can you remind me of the first question?
Yeah, in terms of if you look at the industries that China is interested in, is there kind of a top few industries they're most focused on, or is this really very broad and widespread?
For the training set, I think that's my impression is very much it depends on the geographic region that is being targeted. I think that's where China's presence can affect. It's being aware of what's happening on the ground can really help it. So in the Pacific Islands, for example, you're seeing a lot of climate change and agricultural technical assistance because that's what the region is looking for and needs. Victoria's talked about journalism a fair amount, and I don't know, I might be misattributing, but and that seems to be a point in Latin America that China has been very invested in, and so I think that's sort of my broad answer is like I think that China has targeted certain areas. I think that again would be a very interesting sort of look, to understand what China is trying to achieve in these different areas, whether it is, exporting surveillance to a certain region or affecting the media environment, or what have you, or I'd add sort of like party to party ties, I think are, potentially another area of interest, seeing in Tanzania, the party setup that they have there. Anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Well, I see that Oscar has managed to join us. So Oscar, welcome. We only have 4 or 5 minutes left. So maybe could you give us a couple of minutes of your thoughts on what China is doing in Africa, and what do you think are the things that people should be paying most attention to? Oscar, have we lost you again?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you
my
now.
voice?
Yes.
Anything? You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and really sorry for interruption. I read the report, and thanks for sharing the now to what China is doing in the global south, particularly in Africa, within the context of policy transfer. Is the ideological and material diffusion of Chinese ideas into the global south. Now, what we need to consider here, it's more in terms of how African policy makers and implementers are appropriating, how do they interpret authoritarian ideas. These trainings are going on. We have seen a bunch of Africans going to Beijing, going to Shanghai, and doing all manner of training. But what we need to know is, are these normative ideas, are they getting rooted within African policy space? I'm glad the report mentioned a few cases in Africa, particularly in Tanzania, which we have seen establishment of a training institute. But based on my own experience, if you interact with African policy makers and even those who have closely interacted with a political elite, there is still a huge gap as far as these ideas, how the Chinese authoritarianism have taken root among the policymakers. The training may be attractive to political elite, but the actual diffusion isn't happening at all. I get the opportunity to review a policy, rather to review a manuscript, and I liked the point the author, highlighting a few cases and saying, through interactions with a number of policymakers, you don't see them citing, articulating, Chinese practice. And so, to me, I got the impression that there is a huge gap. And of course, the gap is there because, one, the capacity building isn't done in a better way. There has not Chinese policymakers have not been able to critically make an assessment of political, economic, and if socioeconomic normative framework, exactly to point out what are the issues, where should they be able to come in and conduct specific training. Here we are seeing people going to Beijing and doing all those things, but there isn't a clear policy framework. There is no open dialogue, and therefore what we are seeing here is lack of transparency as far as these trainings are concerned. So those are my initial thoughts. I had prepared a few notes, so I will be glad to share and enrich this discussion further. But thanks for the opportunity.
No, that was great. I'm glad we were able to bring you in at the end. Sadly, we are running out of time, so I think this is probably a good opportunity to say that there's a lot more to talk about here, and hopefully there will be future sessions like this. Congratulations to Neva and to everyone else for this really important research. And just a reminder to everyone online that the report will be available tomorrow. So go to the Atlantic Council's China Hub webpage and Google it and have a read. It's short and it's very interesting. So it's a quick read, but it's a very worthwhile read. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the participants and to the Atlantic Council. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Thank you.